From WRAL News, I'm executive producer Ashley Talley, and this is How to Commit Journalism, where we go behind the scenes and hear the backstory behind the big story. This week's big story is, of course, what it has been for the past several weeks, coronavirus. But today we're looking into some political intrigue that played out against the background of this pandemic. As often happens, national media outlets sometimes get big stories that relate to our local people or politicians, and that's what happened with this story about Senator Richard Burr.
This is WRAL News, your number one source for local news.
North Carolina Senator Richard Burr is in the national spotlight tonight. A news outlet aired a recording of him at a February event.
He was warning some club members that COVID-19 could be extremely dangerous in the United States. Critics say Burr should have been saying that to the public in general as well, and Laura Leslie has the story.
Senator Richard Burr can be heard warning attendees at a members-only luncheon that COVID-19 could shut down schools and travel.
There's one thing that I can tell you about this. It is much more aggressive in its transmission than anything that we have seen in recent history. It's probably more akin to the 1918 pandemic.
That luncheon was on February 27th, the same day President Donald Trump told the public at a news conference that the outbreak in the U.S. was going to be, quote, down to close to zero in a couple of days.
Today I'm talking with our Politifact reporter, Paul Specht, about how that story played out in our own newsroom.
This is not one of those, I remember where I was days, but I do remember that I was driving into work and heard on NPR. This was the morning of March 19th, this big NPR story. So can you kind of walk us through what that NPR story talked about?
Right. And as you mentioned, it played out sort of in two parts that day. The first was the NPR story where investigative reporter Tim Mack was given a secret recording. That's how NPR described it, of Senator Burr speaking to people about the risk of coronavirus. And basically the upshot is that Burr was warning these people about the dangers and high risk of an outbreak here in the U.S. at a time when other politicians were sort of downplaying the risk, especially to the economy.
In fact, the same day, right? I think the same day that he did this talk that was recorded, I think there's tape of President Trump saying this will all be over in a couple of weeks.
I think that's right.
This is mid-February, all right? I think it's February 13th is when this meeting happened. Does that sound right?
That sounds right.
Okay. So you dug a lot into what this meeting was. Like you said, the NPR, even the headline, I believe, says, told secret meeting, warned secret meeting about coronavirus's danger. What did you find out about that meeting?
Right. And I think a lot of people confused the meeting with the recording, because when NPR tweeted its story, it said that it was a secret recording. But the meeting itself was not exactly secret. It was held by a group called the North Carolina Society in Washington. This is a social group, and there are a lot of groups like these in D.C. where lawmakers and business types and even lobbyists and just people with background or ties to specific states, in this case North Carolina, will throw in $25 to be a year-long member of this society. And that gets you invitations to luncheons, like once a month, things like that. The purpose typically is just to bring people together with a similar background and with ties to these states. And from what I can tell about this meeting and what I was told about it is that it's very casual. It's a luncheon once a month. It's maybe a barbecue once a year, an annual barbecue. In fact, North Carolina has an annual barbecue, their society does, as well as there's like a seafood event as well. And in this case, it was a luncheon and Burr was the speaker. And it was a Republican venue. And that's where I think some people got the perception that it was his donors, Burr's donors. It was held at the Capitol Hill Club. And that is a social venue, but it was only moved there because the normal venue, the Capitol Visitor Center, where most of these North Carolina society luncheons are held, didn't have enough seating capacity.
Got ya. And you know a lot of this because you talked to somebody who's actually there, right?
I spoke with people who, a man named Brad Edwards, and I emailed with who is part of the society, as well as another woman with the society as well. But I also spoke with Jim Trogdon, and if his name sounds familiar, that's because he was the transportation secretary for Governor Roy Cooper.
Oh,
and a
Democrat.
He just happened. That's right, a Democrat, and he just happened to be in D.C. On the day that this was held, and was invited to just come listen.
Could anybody go? Did you have to be a member of that group?
If I were rating this for Politifact, I would give that headline about it being private a half true. And here's why. It was private, but it also wasn't. You could pay your way in. That sounds bad, but as these societies work, you pay a fee every year. For North Carolina Society, it's $25 a year. And for the sponsorship group, Tar Heel Circle, which is part of the society, it's $500 a year. And you can always give more, but that's the entry to be part of a more exclusive club with exclusive luncheons and things like that. And that's what this was. This was a Tar Heel Circle event. So
the North Carolina Society, is that the name of the bigger?
That's right.
Group? Okay, so the Tar Heel Circle is a smaller group with a higher pay-in, if you will, within the North Carolina Society. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay. And so they were holding this event. So did that mean you had to have, paid at least $500 to get in this inner circle to be at this event?
Likely. That is likely what you would have had to happen. But I spoke with Brad Edwards and emailed with Deborah Bryant, and they were the chairs of the Tar Heel Circle last year. And they said, if someone were to walk up and they were to know one of the members already, if they were a guest of one of the members, they would have been allowed in. So it's private, but there are ways to get in either by paying the annual membership fees or by knowing a member and being their guest.
So was Jim Trogdon a member of this?
He's not. He came as a guest of the governor's, I believe, liaison is not his official title, but the governor has someone who's up there in D.C., and he came as his guest. And Mr. Trogdon is obviously the transportation secretary, or he was the transportation secretary until last month when he stepped down.
Was he transportation secretary when he went to this meeting?
He was. So this was in February, and then at the end of February, he stepped down. So we've been a month without him now. But yes, he was obviously in an official position, and they even told him, hey, you're a guest with us. We don't know when you're coming back. If Senator Burr can't make it, can you get up there and speak?
That's interesting. And so just to be clear, because I know people might wonder, his stepping down didn't have anything to do with this meeting or anything, right?
No, not at all. This was planned. He had announced that before this meeting even happened.
So Senator Burr is the featured speaker for this bipartisan, at least to a certain extent, audience. What does he say?
I asked Mr. Trogdon about that. And I also asked him about the nature of Burr's remarks. Was he secretive? Did he ever say, like, now this is did he give a disclaimer that it was confidential or classified or anything like that? And Trogdon said no. He said, Senator Burr just got up there and started talking about what he's working on, what his committee, what kind of things his committee, he's on the Senate Intelligence Committee, what kinds of things he could say about that. And then he started talking about coronavirus. And he said that it looked bad. He said it meaning the virus looked bad. And Burr said it looks a lot more serious than we initially thought. And Trogdon said he didn't think anything of it. He did not walk away from that luncheon thinking, oh, wow, Senator Burr just gave us some new information. That's not the impression that he got, or at least that he told me about. I will say, to circle back on the nature of the meeting, I asked the organizers is this an off-the-record luncheon? And they said, it's understood that way, that most people, most people aren't supposed to take photos or take recordings or write it down for a story. But there is no disclaimer, there's no announcement or anything like that. And Burr didn't give one either.
That gets us to the question of who took this video. Do we know?
I don't know. I don't think we know. I don't think NPR has reported that.
It was a surreptitious recording as far as we know. Is that right? Do we have any idea why this person recorded it or anything?
We don't, no.
I want to talk about Laura's coverage that day because as she dug, like I said, she sort of came away with the same feeling that you did, that NPR might have been in the half-true area, like you said, for Politifact. Yes, Burr was warning of a pandemic as Trump downplayed the coronavirus, which I think was Laura's headline, but it did not seem at that point to be any sort of nefarious or behind the scenes, oh boy, let me tell you about this virus. Is that your impression?
That was my impression too. And another thing that we saw on social media, and I'm sure Laura saw, was a lot of people said that he told his donors this information about coronavirus. One thing that the event organizers told me is that this invitation to this event did not go out to just Republicans or just Burr donors. It wasn't targeted that way. It was publicized the way they normally do it in the Society newsletter and on the Society social media website and social media pages. And so NPR reported, we believe accurately, that there were some of the guests were Burr donors or represented organizations that have donated to his campaign in the past.
Because they actually got an RSVP list. NPR obtained that.
That's correct. And it should be noted, too, that Burr has announced he's not running for re-election.
Not that it was a moot point, but any donor there would likely not be trying to curry favor with a lame duck senator almost. I mean, not that he's lame duck. He still has, a bit left in his time, but it wouldn't be like they were helping push him for the next election.
Right. What's he going to do? What's he going to do with the money for himself?
And I think I had the wrong date. I think I said February 13th, but I think it was February 27th. So it's a little bit later than I said. Coming up next, we look at what happened after the NPR report came out that was actually a lot more interesting to us than this first story. We reported it on WRAL. We gave it the context of what you've talked about, what Laura found out. You're familiar with it because we did a Politifact on it later because of some social media claims. Is that right?
That's right. We started looking into it just because of the various levels of misinformation on, whether or not it was what part of this story was secret and how did his donors play into it. And of course, this meeting, as people probably know by this point, was dwarfed later that day by information about Burr selling stocks. That was the second and even bigger domino to fall here.
ProPublica came out with a report that they first reported that he dumped $1.6 million. We have to give kudos to our political web producer, Matt Burns, who actually did the math himself and learned that they were wrong. It was actually more than that. It was more 1.7 and it was more stocks than they had originally said. But in any case, showing that he had sold off stock after talking about it with this group, right?
Well, no, I'm sorry. That was even before he spoke to this group. Your date that you mentioned earlier, February 13th, that's when he unloaded up to 1.7 million in stocks.
Got ya. Okay. So what are the implications of that?
Obviously, people accused him of trading on insider information. Burr himself invited an investigation from the Senate Ethics Committee and said he would be fully transparent with it. And so that, I believe that's where we are now, is waiting for that investigation to launch and wrap up. and then publicize its findings.
So let's go back to the February 13th, though. I think that's really interesting because I know that we had our first case, positive case for coronavirus here in North Carolina on March 3rd. I remember because it was our primary election day, and that tossed things into chaos. But that was 2, possibly even 3 weeks before there was even a case in North Carolina. Was this insider information that he had? I mean, did he get this information from his position on the Intelligence Committee? Was he looking at places that any person could, find publicly, which is what he's claiming, right? He says that I used information in the public media and the public sphere that anybody could have gotten.
Right. That's his defense. And that's what he's claiming, that he did nothing wrong. He used publicly available information. What we've reported at RAL is that he did receive, because of his position on the Senate Intelligence Committee, a special briefing on January 24th. And that's what people are suspicious of.
When the ProPublica thing dropped later that day, we obviously, like I said, jumped on that too. Got the these are public documents that by law have to be filed every so often. So we obtained those. One thing that was interesting is it's not just how much he sold, but what he sold. I remember reading that he sold a bunch of hotel stock and things that would, because of the coronavirus, tank, quite honestly. So, there's a question of, was this a savvy investor's prescience of what was to come, or did he have some sort of inside information? I think one thing that brings that into question is if he did have that information, certainly the president would too.
That's the assumption. And our story says that he was briefed by administration officials. January 24th, he was briefed. February 13th is when he sold the stock.
It turned out he wasn't the only senator who had done something similar in about the same time frame. What do you know about that?
That's right. Georgia's senator, who's new, very new, was appointed last year. Her name is Kelly, and I don't want to mispronounce her last name. Loeffler, I believe, is how you pronounce it, was also found to have sold stocks.
Interesting note on her. She's married to the president of the New York Stock Exchange. She is one of the wealthiest people in Congress, and she's never been elected. She was appointed to that position within the past year or two when somebody left. One thing that I found interesting with her is that she sold, yes, but she also bought. And one thing that she bought was Citrix stock, which is, we're familiar with it because it's the internal computer system that keeps our data safe. And so knowing people are working from home, that stock's, got to be doing really well. I thought that was an interesting side note. Like, that was very savvy to know that was going to go up when the hotel businesses and other things were going to go down. She says that hers was an automatic thing, right? Or that it was her financial advisors, that she didn't have anything to do with it. This goes across the aisles, though.
People accused Dianne Feinstein of also selling off stocks, but they're not in the spotlight as much, I guess, for whatever reason. I don't know as much about their cases, but they haven't aroused as much suspicion. As for Loeffler, the Georgia senator, there's more that keeps coming out about her. Vox.com reported today that Loeffler sold $18 million, up to $18 million more than previously reported. And so news about her is, obviously Burr's in headlines still, but it sort of eclipsed him at this point.
Dianne Feinstein originally said that hers was blind trading as well, but then I think she came out and said that actually her husband did it. So
that's what I heard too.
What rule are they violating by this?
Well, first of all, they're not allowed to trade on insider information. Well, an interesting thing about that, and I don't have this in front of me, but when there was a related bill that came up during Burr's tenure, he was one of only a handful of people to vote against it. It was 2012. Here we go. Congress made it illegal for members to profit financially from inside information they receive. He was only one of 3 senators to vote against that 2012 bill.
We won't go down that rabbit hole, but I mean, clearly this is a law that was voted in that they're potentially violating. Coming up in the last segment, we're going to talk about what happens from here, what the future of this story might bring. The most recent development to this story came Monday when CNN reported that Senator Burr is now being investigated, that the Justice Department has launched an investigation and that the FBI has contacted Burr. One thing I found interesting is that when we reached out to his folks, typically his press people would get back with us. This time, who got back with us was the director of a PR and communications firm that he has apparently hired. So, you have to wonder what sort of damage control he's in now, what if that's the mode that he's in. The statement said something like, the law is clear that any American, including a senator, may participate in the stock market based on public information, as Senator Burr did. When this issue arose, Senator Burr immediately asked the Senate Ethics Committee to conduct a complete review, and he will cooperate with that review as well as any other appropriate inquiry. Senator Burr welcomes a thorough review of the facts in this matter, which will establish that his actions were appropriate. And I think one of the things about this story is that it's hard to prove, right? I mean,
Totally.
What you know, when you know it, and what your motive is are sort of nebulous things, I think.
Right. How are we going to know, what information that he read did he act on? And I'm assuming that his, especially given his position, his news consumption or his information consumption, jumps from classified to public on a hourly basis almost. So I'm not a lawyer, but I imagine it would be very hard to prove that he acted on one piece of information and not the other.
What do you see as the next steps of this story as WRAL is concerned and as national media? Where do you see it going from here?
Well, I guess we're going to wait and see what the DOJ does and how the Senate Ethics Committee investigation plays out. He's not up for re-election until 2022.
But to your point, he's not running for re-election in 2022.
That's right. But if he were to, let's say, so it depends. If he resigns or is removed this calendar year, then North Carolina would have a special election in November to replace him. I'm not speaking for any party here, but if I were running the Republican Party, I certainly wouldn't want to put up his replacement in this year, which is so weird and unpredictable. I would much rather get my ducks in a row for 2 years from now rather than, have something else up in the air a few months from now.
Especially in this very important seat, which, Burr's a longtime senator. He holds very esteemed positions. To lose that seat would be a major blow to the Republican Party. They're also dealing with Senator Tillis's reelection coming this November. So that would be very detrimental, it seems. All right. Well, I know WRAL and you in your role as Politifact and Laura Leslie will continue to stay on that. Thanks for talking with us today, Paul.
Yeah.
How to Commit Journalism is produced by WRAL News and is part of Capital Broadcasting Company's podcast network. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen to yours. But you can also go to WRAL.com, search podcast, and you'll see a list of all the different podcasts produced by our station and our company. One you might be interested in right now is a daily podcast that we're putting out all about coronavirus. Again, you'll find that at WRAL.com. Thanks for listening.